For most of human history, the ocean was not a place of freedom. It was a place of fear. When sailors left the shore, they did not believe they were traveling across water. They believed they were entering a world that was alive, watching, waiting. There were no maps for most of the sea, no satellites, no rescue, only darkness, storms, and stories whispered by men who survived. Sailors believed the ocean punished arrogance, that it remembered insults, that it demanded sacrifices. They believed something lived beneath the waves. Not one thing, many. Creatures that pulled ships downward, voices that called men by name from the fog, islands that were not islands, waters that drove sailors mad. These were not fantasies created for entertainment. These were explanations, attempts to make sense of disappearances, wrecks, madness, and death. For those who lived at sea, the ocean was never empty. To ancient sailors, the sea was not an object. It was a force with intention. In Greek belief, the ocean had a ruler, Poseidon, god of storms and earthquakes, whose moods shaped the fate of ships. But even Poseidon did not control everything beneath the waves. There were older things, darker things. Sailors believed the sea listened, that speaking too loudly, boasting, or mocking the water could bring disaster. This belief shaped countless superstitions. Many sailors refused to whistle aboard ships, believing the sound summoned storms. Others avoided speaking certain words entirely, fearing they would attract attention from something below. Shipwrecks were not accidents, they were judgments. If a crew vanished, it meant the sea had taken payment. If a ship returned damaged but afloat, it meant the ocean had shown mercy. Ancient Mediterranean sailors told stories of beings that lived just below the surface, unseen but always present. One of the oldest fears was the idea that the sea could open. That water itself could pull downward with impossible strength. This fear gave birth to the myth of Charybdis, a monstrous force that swallowed entire ships, creating whirlpools large enough to drag men, cargo, and timber into the abyss. Sailors described the sound before it appeared, a deep roaring, as if the sea itself was breathing in. Few who were pulled into it were ever seen again. To pass near such waters was to accept that survival was a matter of chance, not skill. Equally feared was Scylla, not a storm or current, but a living predator. She was said to dwell in cliffs, overlooking narrow passages, striking from above and below at the same time. Sailors believed that even seeing her meant death was close. These myths reflected a simple truth. Narrow straits were dangerous, rocks were hidden, currents were unpredictable. The sea killed without warning. Myths gave these deaths a face. As sailors ventured farther from shore, the sea changed. The Mediterranean gave way to the Atlantic, darker, colder, more violent. Here, the myths grew larger. Scandinavian sailors believed the ocean was ruled by giants and serpents older than the gods. The most feared was Jormungandr, the world serpent, so vast that it encircled the entire earth. When it moved, storms followed. When it surfaced, ships vanished. Sailors believed that one day it would rise fully, and the sea itself would collapse into chaos. Across northern waters, sailors told stories of ghost ships, vessels seen through fog, glowing faintly, crewed by the dead. The most famous of these legends became known as the Flying Dutchman, a ship doomed to sail forever, never reaching port. To see it was considered a sign of disaster. Death, storm, or wreck would soon follow. These sightings were often reported by exhausted crews after days without sleep, staring into mist and darkness. But belief gave the vision weight. Fear made it real. The ocean also attacked the mind. Long voyages meant isolation, repetition, and constant danger. Sailors spoke of voices carried on the wind, calling them by name. They believed these were spirits of drowned men, or sea demons luring sailors overboard. This belief shaped the myth of the sirens. Not beautiful singers in the modern sense, but deadly presences whose voices broke concentration. A sailor who listened too long would lose his will. He would step into the water without struggle. Many men were lost this way, not because of monsters, but because exhaustion and despair overcame reason. Myth turned madness into narrative. One of the most enduring sea myths was that of the Kraken. Sailors described a creature so large it was mistaken for an island. Ships that anchored near it would be dragged under when it moved. In reality, giant squids existed, rarely seen, surfacing only in deep waters. But to sailors who saw massive tentacles rise from the sea, explanation was unnecessary. They had seen enough. The Kraken became a symbol of the unknown depths, proof that the sea hid things humans were never meant to face. As exploration expanded, sailors reached waters where compasses failed, winds died, and currents behaved strangely. The Sargasso Sea became a place of terror. Ships could become trapped in floating seaweed for weeks. Crews starved. Water ran out. Men went mad. Survivors told stories of ships frozen in endless calm, surrounded by silence, as if the ocean itself had stopped time. Some believed the Sargasso Sea was cursed. Others believed it was a graveyard of lost souls. Even death at sea was different. Sailors believed drowning did not always mean peace. Many cultures believed those who died at sea became part of it, that the ocean absorbed them, that storms were fed by the dead. This is why sailors held rituals before voyages. Offerings were made, prayers spoken, not to gods of heaven, but to the water itself. Survival depended on respect. These myths did not disappear with science. Even in the age of maps and engines, sailors continued to speak of strange lights on the horizon, of massive shadows beneath ships, of sudden silences before disaster. Technology reduced ignorance, but it did not remove fear, because the ocean remains vast, and most of it remains unseen. The sea has never stopped taking ships. It has never stopped taking lives, and as long as humans cross it, stories will follow. Not because sailors are foolish, but because when you stare into something that deep, something that powerful, the mind looks for meaning. And myth is how fear survives memory. The age of exploration did not erase fear of the sea. It multiplied it. As ships traveled farther than ever before, sailors encountered waters that seemed to defy logic. Compasses spun without reason. Winds died suddenly, leaving vessels motionless for days. Stars vanished behind endless clouds. One of the most infamous regions was what would later be called the Bermuda Triangle. Long before the name existed, sailors already avoided these waters. Ships entered and never returned. Crews vanished without wreckage. Logs ended mid-sentence. For centuries, this area was believed to be a place where the sea consumed memory itself. Some sailors believed it was a gateway, a place where the ocean folded inward and swallowed vessels whole. Others believed ancient powers guarded the region, punishing those who crossed invisible boundaries. Rational explanations would come much later, but fear existed long before science. Sailors also believed certain ships were cursed. A vessel that had carried plague victims, slaves, or the dead was thought to absorb misfortune. No matter how strong the hull or skilled the crew, such ships were believed to attract disaster. Fires broke out without cause. Storms followed relentlessly. Crews mutinied or went mad. The ship itself was blamed. Sailors spoke of vessels that refused to sink, drifting endlessly with no living crew aboard. To encounter one was considered a sign that death was near. These stories spread quickly, carried from port to port, by men who swore they had seen them with their own eyes. Captains in particular were believed to shape a ship's fate. A cruel or arrogant captain was said to anger the sea. His decisions invited punishment. Many legends speak of captains who defied storms, refused to turn back, or mocked warnings. Their ships were never seen again. The Flying Dutchman became the most famous of these legends. But he was not alone. Every coastline had stories of doomed captains whose pride sealed their fate. To sailors, leadership was not just skill. It was moral balance. The sea punished imbalance. Weather itself became myth. Sudden storms were believed to be attacks. Calm seas were seen as traps. A complete lack of wind terrified sailors more than storms. Ships drifting without movement became floating prisons. Water spoiled, food rotted, discipline collapsed. In these moments, sailors believed the sea was watching, waiting for desperation to turn into sacrifice. Accounts describe men thrown overboard in madness, or volunteers who believed offering themselves would appease the water. These were not common, but they were remembered. Navigation myths also flourished. Sailors believed certain stars protected them, while others warned of death. A red moon meant blood. A green flash at sunset meant a soul had been claimed. Albatrosses were considered sacred. Killing one was believed to bring catastrophe. This belief became so strong that sailors would risk punishment rather than harm the bird. When disaster followed the death of an albatross, the myth was confirmed. Memory favors fear. As ships entered polar waters, new horrors appeared. Icebergs were described as living mountains. Fog became an enemy. Sound vanished. Ships crushed silently. Survivors spoke of shapes moving beneath the ice. Creatures adapted to cold darkness. Whether real or imagined, the fear was constant. Men felt watched. The ocean was no longer just water. It was an environment hostile to life. One of the most terrifying sailor beliefs was that the sea could choose its victims, that some men were marked. Ships could survive countless storms, only to be lost on calm water. Survivors spoke of a feeling before disaster, a pressure in the air, a silence, a sense that something had already been decided. Fate was not abstract at sea. It was immediate. As centuries passed, science explained currents, magnetism, weather patterns, but sailors continued to report the same experiences. Strange lights beneath the water, massive shadows pacing ships for hours, sudden drops in temperature, compasses freezing in place. Even today, submarines record unexplained sounds. The ocean remains largely unmapped. More than space, it hides itself. What sailors feared most was not monsters. It was indifference. The sea did not hate. It did not care. It took without reason and spared without logic. Myths tried to give it rules. To believe in punishment was easier than accepting randomness. To believe in curses was easier than admitting vulnerability. Every myth told at sea served one purpose: to prepare the mind, to give form to fear, to remind sailors that once they left land, control was an illusion. And in the darkness, surrounded by endless water, stories were the only defense against silence. As ships crossed into truly unknown waters, sailors began to fear not only what lived in the sea, but what the sea did to time and to reality itself. Long voyages distorted perception. Days blurred together. The horizon never changed. Men lost their sense of direction, of distance, of self. Sailors believed there were places where time slowed or stopped entirely. Ships were said to return decades later, unchanged, while the world they left behind had moved on. Others were believed to vanish into these regions forever. The ocean, in these stories, was not just space. It was a boundary between worlds. One of the most common fears was the idea of phantom lands. Sailors reported seeing islands rise from the sea, complete with trees, cliffs, and beaches, only for them to disappear as ships approached. These were called false islands. Some believed they were living beings, massive creatures sleeping beneath the surface. Others believed they were traps created by the sea itself. Many ships altered course toward these visions and were never seen again. Later explanations spoke of mirages, light bending over water, exhaustion. But for sailors, the explanation mattered less than the outcome. Men vanished. Ships were lost. The fear of becoming lost forever haunted every crew. Not lost in space, but lost in memory. Sailors believed that if no one remembered your name, if no one spoke of you on land, the sea claimed you completely. This belief made logbooks sacred. Names were recorded obsessively. Deaths were written down with care. To be erased from the record was worse than death. It meant becoming part of the ocean itself. The sea also changed men. Sailors believed prolonged exposure to the ocean altered the body and mind. Some believed men who spent too long at sea became something else, not fully human. Stories spoke of sailors who refused to return to land, who felt uncomfortable on solid ground, who stared at the horizon endlessly. These men were thought to belong to the sea now. The myth of mermaids was not always about beauty. In many accounts, mermaids were once human. Sailors who had given themselves to the ocean and could no longer return. Mermaids were not always kind. Early sailor accounts described them as omens, not temptations. Seeing one meant disaster was near. They appeared before storms or wrecks. Their presence was a warning. Over time, these warnings were romanticized, but their origin was fear. Fear of transformation. Fear of losing humanity to the sea. Madness was another constant companion. Scurvy, dehydration, lack of sleep, and isolation pushed men beyond reason. Sailors reported hearing footsteps on deck when no one was there, voices from below, laughter in the fog. They believed the sea was speaking to them, that it tested resolve, that those who listened too closely would never return. In extreme cases, crews turned on each other. Cannibalism occurred. These acts were later spoken of in whispers, framed as curses rather than desperation. Myth softened guilt. Even rescue carried fear. Sailors distrusted unfamiliar ships. A vessel approaching in silence could be a trap. Ghost ship legends fed this paranoia. Many crews refused aid, fearing deception by spirits or cursed crews. Isolation deepened. Trust narrowed to those already aboard. As navigation improved, sailors reached regions of the world that seemed to contradict everything they knew. Endless night in polar seas, endless daylight, water that froze ships solid, whales larger than houses, creatures that surfaced briefly and vanished. Sailors filled the gaps in knowledge with myth, not out of ignorance, but necessity. Fear without shape is unbearable. Myth gave it shape. The ocean also carried memory. Shipwrecks remained below the surface, preserved in darkness. Sailors believed the sea remembered every life it took, that storms were echoes of past deaths, that certain routes were cursed because too many had died there. Avoidance of these routes became tradition. Tradition became belief. Every generation of sailors inherited these stories. They were told at night, below deck, away from the wind, not to frighten, but to prepare, to remind men that the sea demanded humility. Those who mocked myths often vanished first, or so the story said. In the end, sailor myths were not about monsters. They were about survival, about respecting forces beyond control, about giving meaning to loss. The ocean remains vast. It remains largely unknown. And as long as humans cross it, they will continue to tell stories. not because they want to believe in monsters, but because the sea makes belief unavoidable. If you want, next I can bring this toward a strong, closing arc for the final section, or continue deeper into specific documented sailor accounts, to anchor the myths in real history. As sailors returned to land, they carried the sea with them. The stories did not stay aboard ships. They entered taverns, ports, and cities. They became warnings told to young men before their first voyage. They became rituals, habits, and laws of behavior that shaped maritime culture for centuries. Even sailors who claimed not to believe followed the rules, not because they were superstitious, but because the cost of being wrong was too high. Certain days were avoided for departure. Certain routes were taken even when longer. Objects were carried for protection, coins nailed to masts, symbols carved into wood, names spoken before storms. Silence kept at specific moments. These actions gave sailors the illusion of control in a world where control barely existed. When something went wrong, the cause was never random. It was always a broken rule, a forgotten ritual, a disrespect shown to the sea. Some myths focused on punishment after death. Sailors believed that dying at sea without proper rites condemned the soul to wander. Ghostly figures seen on deck at night were believed to be restless spirits of drowned men, unable to leave the ocean. This belief made burial at sea a solemn act. Words mattered. Gestures mattered. Without them, the dead would return. Other myths focused on warning signs: sudden animal behavior, fish leaping from the water, changes in the color of the sea, a strange stillness before storms. Sailors learned to read these signs instinctively. Long before meteorology, observation kept men alive. Myth preserved that knowledge. What could not be explained scientifically was remembered symbolically. Some sailors feared that the sea itself was expanding, that it was slowly reclaiming land. Flood myths existed in nearly every maritime culture. The belief that the ocean once swallowed entire civilizations reinforced the idea that humanity was temporary. This belief encouraged humility. Arrogance was punished. Survival required submission. The deeper sailors went, the more they believed the sea separated the living world from something else. Edges of the map were feared, not because they were empty, but because they were thresholds. Beyond them, rules might change. Time, gravity, life itself could behave differently. Early maps marked these regions with warnings, not measurements. Here be monsters, not as decoration, but as admission of ignorance. Even modern sailors report experiences that echo ancient myths: sudden fear without cause, a sense of being watched, equipment failing simultaneously, sounds beneath ships that do not match known animals. These moments revive old stories instantly. Technology has not replaced instinct. It has only delayed it. The ocean remains the largest unknown on Earth. More of it is unmapped than the surface of distant planets. Darkness begins just meters below the surface. Pressure crushes anything human-made. Life exists in forms still barely understood. This reality keeps myth alive. Knowledge has limits. Fear begins where limits end. Sailor myths endure because they were never meant to be proven. They were meant to be remembered. They taught caution, respect, and awareness. They warned against arrogance. They explained loss. They gave grief a voice. When a ship vanished, families needed meaning. Myth provided it. In the end, the sea does not care what humans believe. It does not need monsters to kill. Storms, waves, and silence are enough. But belief shapes how humans face it. A sailor who believes the sea listens behaves differently than one who believes it is empty. And behavior determines survival. The ocean has always been a mirror. It reflects fear, hope, desperation, and courage. It turns imagination into necessity. That is why myths were born on its surface and beneath it. Not to entertain, but to endure. And as long as ships sail beyond the horizon, as long as humans leave land behind, the sea will continue to create stories. Because where certainty ends, myth begins. As the centuries passed, the myths of sailors slowly merged with recorded history. Ship logs began to preserve fear in written form. Captains wrote about impossible waves, sudden darkness at noon, and seas that behaved as if something beneath them was moving. These were not drunk storytellers in taverns. These were trained navigators, men whose survival depended on accuracy. Yet again and again, their words crossed into the territory of the unreal. One recurring account described waves that did not break, walls of water rising vertically, moving as a single mass, then vanishing without trace. Today, these are called rogue waves, but for centuries they were considered proof that the sea could strike without warning, choosing its moment with intention. Sailors believed these waves were punishments or tests. Entire ships were erased in seconds. No debris, no survivors, just absence. Another fear was silence, the sudden disappearance of wind, sound, and movement. Sailors described moments when the ocean became unnaturally still. Birds vanished. The air felt heavy. In these moments, men believed they had crossed into forbidden space. Many accounts describe disasters, following shortly after, reinforcing the belief that silence was a warning, not peace. The sea also erased boundaries between life and death. Sailors believed drowned men did not leave the ocean. They joined it. Storms carried their anger. Currents carried their memory. In some cultures, sailors spoke to the water before sleeping, asking it not to remember their names. Forgetting meant safety. Being remembered meant being taken. Cannibalism at sea became one of the darkest myths turned reality. When ships were wrecked far from land, survivors drifted for weeks. Hunger broke social order. After rescue, survivors often refused to speak of what happened. Others framed their actions as curses, madness, or possession. Myth absorbed guilt. It allowed men to live with what they had done. Some ships returned with crews changed beyond recognition. Silent, detached, unable to sleep on land. Sailors believed part of them remained at sea, that something followed them home. Families noticed it. Men stared at water endlessly. Some returned to the ocean voluntarily and were never seen again. These disappearances reinforced the belief that the sea could claim ownership over those who survived it too long. There were also stories of ships that should not exist. Vessels found drifting with no crew, food untouched, personal belongings in place. No sign of struggle, no damage. The most famous cases became legends, but there were many lesser-known ones. Sailors believed such ships crossed into places humans were not meant to go, then returned empty. These stories spread fear faster than storms. As steam replaced sail, fear did not vanish. It adapted. Engines failed inexplicably. Radios picked up voices that were not there. Submarines reported massive objects pacing them beneath the surface, too large to identify. Even modern sonar sometimes returns shapes that defy classification. The deep remains hostile to certainty. What sailors feared most, in the end, was not death. It was disappearance without meaning. A body lost to the sea meant no grave, no closure, no certainty. Myth filled that void. It said the dead were not gone. They were transformed, absorbed, remembered. This is why sailor myths persist. They are not primitive. They're human. They arise where risk is constant and control is limited. The sea exposes that limit better than any other place on Earth. It reminds humans they are small, temporary, replaceable. Soon, exploration shifted away from the sea toward the sky and space. But the psychology remained the same. The unknown produces stories. The hostile environment demands meaning. Sailors were simply the first to live permanently at the edge of that unknown. The ocean has never been conquered. It has been crossed, studied, measured, but not mastered. And because it cannot be mastered, it continues to generate fear, respect, and myth in equal measure.